Transitions between scenes are so easy to forget about, but with just a little bit of planning, they can add so much momentum and fun to your story. They save you from awkward edits, and in the hands of great filmmakers, these two transitions we're talking about today tell the story. And to illustrate this, let's take a little Fine Art 101 lesson. Now, if you take any kind of drawing or painting class, you're going to learn about positive and negative space. The positive space is, if you're doing a portrait, the subject, Travis Bickle here. And then the negative space is all the blank room around him on the canvas. A skilled artist thinks about their negative space just as much as their positive space because one simply cannot work without the other. It's a yin-yang situation. So if you have two scenes in your film, what is the positive space? Well, it's going to be your characters, your dialogue, setting, cinematography, all that stuff. What's the negative space? The negative space is that transition between those two scenes. And that transition is doing just as much for your audience as the positive space that surrounds it. And when you start to think this way about the storytelling potential of that negative space between the scenes, you really start to unlock some much more mature storytelling methods for your own films. Now, the first transition we're going to talk about is one of the most powerful and elegant storytelling transition, which is the match cut. In a match cut, you're cutting from one image to another that's either visually similar in some way or sometimes even just thematically similar. Sometimes incorporating a match cut into your film is super obvious, like in my short film Hawaii, which revolved around a lighter being passed down through generations. I wanted to cut forwards and backwards in time as a storytelling device, and the easiest way to do that was obviously going to be to use the lighter. So I could do a match cut transition like this and introduce that storytelling device of jumping backwards and forwards in time to the audience that way. Now, the Film School 101 examples of a match cut would be Stanley Kubrick's 2001 Space Odyssey, this famous transition from the bone to the spaceship. This is telling the whole story of man's evolution using technology in one cut. Very powerful match cut. Another famous example, this one from Lawrence of Arabia, where he lights the match and suddenly we are in the desert with the hot sun, match cutting from the flame of the match. And here's some other famous examples of match cuts. There's one that I feel is always underrepresented in film schools, and that is this incredible use of the match cut in the film Me, Myself, and Irene.
That looks good.
That is a breathtaking display of storytelling. So as you can see, match cuts are a clear example of how a transition can actually tell the story rather than just get you from point A to point B in a flashy way. But you don't want to do a match cut all the time. This is a seasoning that you should use sparingly in your films or videos because you get really diminishing returns on the magic of it after the first one. Fortunately, the second transition I want to discuss, you can use over and over because it isn't so in your face as the match cut, and this is going to be a transition of contrast. Now, to do a contrast cut, all you got to do is cut from one thing to something that is very different in some way, and it can be any way that you can think of, but the effect that you get from it is that it's a very smooth and intentional feeling transition, which is important to avoid having an awkward cut from one scene to another. For example, if you end one scene super quiet and your next scene starts in the mosh pit of a metal concert, we, your audience members, are going to have a lot of fun with that surprising and very intentional feeling transition. And the cool thing about these contrast cuts is there's endless types of contrast that you can exploit to use this kind of transition. For example, you can go from a scene that's at night to a scene that's in the day, a loud scene to a quiet scene in a big crowd to being totally alone. You can do a tight close-up to a wide establishing shot. You can do a shot emphasizing stillness to a shot emphasizing movement, an old person to a child. You're really only limited by your imagination. Here's an example from my last film, The Little Helpers. We started outside in this loud, noisy blizzard, and then we cut inside to an extremely delicate, quiet shot of the thread going through the needle. Now, this is another transition that isn't only effective in that whoa, cool kind of a way, but actually helps you tell the story. For example, take a look at this transition in The Master.
I'm gonna go out tonight.
Yeah, sure.
We learned so much about him. That one transition simultaneously revealed character. It ramped up the pacing of the story by skipping all that stuff we didn't need to actually see play out. It gave the audience a really solid laugh. And on top of all that, it feels cinematic whatever that means. So let's create our own example. Let's say we're telling a story about a woman whose internal conflict is that she's afraid of aging. And this isn't something that we want to hammer our audience over the head with. It's just a character trait that we want the audience to be aware of because it's going to influence the decisions that she makes later on in the story. So let's say we did a scene with her in a bar where a younger man was flirting with her, but he ends up losing interest. And she's disappointed, and we end the scene with her stepping outside of this loud, noisy bar, finding her own reflection in the window of the bar late at night. So what would be a strong transition of contrast to go into the next scene where she's going to be starting her day? Well, there's a ton of options because you're already going to have a lot of contrast cutting from the nighttime scene to the next scene, which is in the daytime. You're cutting from a loud bar into a quiet scene in her home, and you're cutting from a crowded scene into one where she's now alone. So you'd really be hard pressed to make this transition straight up bad or awkward. But how do we use this technique of cutting on contrast to tell the story as well? Well, if you want, you can pause the video here and try to come up with your own transition shot to start the next scene with, or I'll tell you what I came up with. One example is you could just be starting the next scene with her making her bed and doing it so that the first thing we see is a close-up of her sheets as she diligently smooths out the wrinkles on it. Do you see how that contrast would reveal and emphasize something about this character indirectly? And immediately tell us that it's the next day. And depending on the actor's performance, it could also tell us whether or not she's still bothered about that thing that happened the night before. So that is an example of good storytelling with your transitions. You're not telling the audience anything with clunky dialogue or exposition or melodramatics. You're showing them two images and letting them figure it out for themselves. That is the power of transitions and this negative space in filmmaking. And in fact, this is sort of an example of both of the transitions that we discussed because there's contrast, but there's also a thematic match by going from one wrinkled mess to another. And that's a very mean thing to call our fictional character a wrinkled mess, but I made her up, so I'll say what I want about her. And the beautiful part about a transition of contrast like this is that unlike the visual match cuts like the 2001 transition, this is directorially pretty subtle. Cutting on contrast is never going to feel heavy-handed, even if it totally is heavy-handed, like this example with smoothing out the wrinkles in her sheets. And that's why you can get away with doing this transition of contrast in almost every scene of your movie if you want. The effect just won't lose its magic when you repeat it over and over in the same film. Another reason these transitions are great is that really the big thing that you need to worry about with the transition from one scene to another being weak is that you end up cutting from one shot to another and nothing is really that different. You can get caught in this no man's land where the two shots that you're transitioning between aren't the same enough to be a match cut and they're not different enough to feel like a contrast cut, and it just looks wrong and awkward. You'll run into this a lot if you're ending one scene on a close-up of a character and again you fail to plan your transition into the next scene, and then you end up starting the opening shot of your next scene also in a close-up of that same character. And even if the character is in a totally different part of the frame, it's really hard to make the transition not feel awkward as hell. And that is one of the many reasons why you should try to train yourself to think like an editor when you're directing. Think about how things are going to cut together. Think about ways that you can protect yourself in the editing room down the road. And in this case, the easiest way to avoid this kind of situation is if you don't have a plan for your transition, try to always grab some inserts or cutaway shots for every scene that you shoot. So if you're shooting, say, a dialogue scene at a bank between the teller and a customer who's crying about their overdraft fee, begging to get it waived, what's an insert shot that you could grab on the day that will not only protect you in the edit of that scene, but protect you in the transition into or out of that scene if you don't have a clear plan for it? Again, you can pause if you want. I'll tell you what I would do. I would definitely grab a few inserts of cash being handled, maybe cash running through one of those cash counting machines, maybe get a cutaway of the line of customers waiting impatiently behind this person who's having their meltdown, or you could get a shot of the bank manager peeking over their desk at the altercation. All of those kinds of shots are excellent transition shots because it's very unlikely that whatever shot comes before or after it in the next scene or the previous scene is going to be in that no man's land where it's kind of similar and it's an awkward cut. Usually an insert shot of an object, for example, like the cash being handled, will end up naturally being a cut on contrast from whatever was before it. And if you've seen any of my YouTube videos here, you might be saying, but Kent, you do corny swoosh zoom YouTuber transitions all the time in your videos. Where's your match cuts? Where's your cutting on contrast? And to that, I would say,
what I need is for you to climb down out of my ass.
So these YouTuber transitions serve a very different purpose from the classic film transitions I was just discussing. The YouTuber transitions usually aren't used for storytelling in a film or video, but instead are used for engagement. So if I'm sitting here, for example, rambling on, a flashy transition like this, well, it spices things up visually, and it maybe helps me keep your attention just a little bit longer. That's why for corporate video editing work, editing ads, these YouTube videos, basically any type of editing that isn't mainly about a story, I always keep a Swiss Army knife of these kinds of transitions handy. And the best and easiest way to get that Swiss Army knife of transitions and much more is with the sponsor of this video, Motion Array. Motion Array has a ton of fun transitions that you can grab and incorporate into your videos to give it that life, that increased engagement that you might be looking for. And on top of that, you can also get templates, stock footage, stock photos, music, sound effects, and they're all great. It's membership based, so that means that you sign up for a month or a year and get everything. You can download whatever you want, use it wherever you want, and there's not gonna be any additional fees. And the best thing about it is how easy it is. When I'm editing, I don't wanna have to leave Premiere unless I absolutely have to. And with Motion Array, they have plugins and extensions for Premiere, for After Effects, for Photoshop, and you can just type in what you want in the little panel there, and boom, pop it right into your project. Motion Array is just the quickest way to make your project look amazing. You can take a simple bland video and turn it from okay to good to great in a shockingly short amount of time with all of their graphics and presets and transitions and music and all this stuff. You can even try Motion Array for free. Of course, you won't get everything they have, but you do get hundreds of free assets for giving it a shot. And if you're interested in trying out Motion Array, my viewers get $50 off an annual plan if you click the link in my description. So give it a shot. Thanks to Motion Array. Now let's talk a little bit more about these types of transitions. Story time here. My first job as a real freelance editor was doing corporate videos, and we had to churn these things out fast. And there's usually just a roll to work with. So we're talking pretty standard talking head style interview footage. So if we were going to show stock footage or cut away to some graphics, we leaned really heavily on fancy transitions like this. The reason? Well, it was a low lift for us, and these productions just didn't have the time to create well thought out transitions. I'm not gonna be doing match cuts from one guy talking to the COO, it just wouldn't make any sense. So things like these push transitions, light leaks, film burns, zooms, and other meaningless in-your-face transitions like this were really the bread and butter for the editing team. So while it's ideal and more artistically satisfying to transition in an intentional, premeditated way, where you can tell a story and say something with a cut, with that negative space, it isn't always possible or even preferable because it can actually distract from the objective of your video if your objective is, for example, informing, educating, motivating, inspiring, something that's not purely telling a story. That said, it does make me a little sad when novice editors think of these flashy YouTuber transitions as a default option for their cuts, or that every cut needs to have something like that thrown on it. It's really not the case. I like to think of these types of transitions like a plunger. You don't need a plunger all that often, but sometimes you get a really boring video and there's just nothing you can do except throw a bunch of flashy transitions into it and make it interesting. What would be really cool is if I could end this video on some kind of creative match cut.